Hi, Mr. Junko and classmates. I'll be describing three sources for you today. Number one, we have this letter from Sibylla, Queen of Jerusalem, to Frederick I of the Holy Roman Empire. It was written in 1189, around the time of the Third Crusade, which notably featured Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. This letter, it's a letter, and it describes how the Empire of the Byzantines had betrayed the Christians and sided with Saladin, hoping that he'd gain back some of his cities, and how Sibylla begs him to spare her citizens, herself, her city, and to give her back her rule. And she also begs him not to trust the Grecian emperor and to spare everyone again. It is a primary source because it was written in 1189 at the time of the Third Crusade, and we know this because of the date and who wrote it, and there have been lots of resources written about Sibylla, who was quite an interesting person. As I just said, the source is written in 1189, and that is important to consider because that was during the Third Crusade, which was quite a bit of a flop, but it resulted in Richard the Lionheart and Saladin going head to head, and it didn't work out very well for the Christians, but they did manage to agree on some things. So that's why it's important to consider that it was written in 1189, whereas it would be different if it was written in 2001 or 1099, which was around the First Crusade. Sibylla, ex-Queen of Jerusalem, made this source, and it's important to consider that because she was the Queen of Jerusalem until Saladin captured Jerusalem. She was important because she was attempting to hold out Saladin before he besieged the city, but her plan was flawed and she was allowed to escape with her daughters. She is important because after she lost her siege, this is very important, Christians could not recapture Jerusalem. They never got it back again. Number 5 is what the source is, why it's useful and such. And the source is very useful because it shows us what was happening at the time of this interaction, and that was the Third Crusade, as I've said. And also, the importance of her role, the letter itself, the tone of the letter. She begs Frederick for help. She needs the help. And the tone of the letter, she is very flattering and very dismissive of the Grecian emperor, whilst also very, she's mature for herself. She represents her people quite well, and she begs for help. And it's quite important. This source was only meant for Frederick and maybe his closest advisor's eyes, so we should trust what Sibylla is saying in it. But at the same time, she was begging to save her city, so the way she structured the letter would not have necessarily reflected the true problem she was facing. As a result, this letter is a very good resource because not only is it a primary resource, it is also written by one of the key figures of the Third Crusade whose actions resulted in the fall of Jerusalem, and shows the side of someone living in the Jerusalem and the surrounding areas during the Third Crusade while still being a Christian leader. Thank you for the first one. The second source I have is an excerpt of Pope Urban's speech, which actually started the Crusades. Now, as I said, it's an excerpt of his speech, so it's not the whole thing, but even in this excerpt, it talks a lot about how we must punish the Muslims and how any Christian who helps fight will be sent to heaven free of their sins. And that was a very key factor in why so many Christians went to the Crusades. Now, this source is again a primary source because it was spoken at the time and was written down very soon afterwards and was recorded in a book for a lot of time. Now, it's a very important primary source, and it was in 1095 in Clermont, France, that this speech was given, and this speech is the only reason the Crusades happened in the first place. And it's very important to remember why they happened, which was because the Christians were angry that their land had been taken, their pilgrims were being attacked, and they also kind of wanted to steal the resources that the Middle East had because they were very rich at the time and held a lot of the trade. So that's why it's important to remember how old the source is, because 1095 was just before the start of the Crusades, and I believe the People's Crusade happened very soon afterwards. As I said, Pope Urban was the one who made this source. Now, he is the Pope who started the Crusades, and this is just very important because his speech at Clermont was the only reason all the lords and knights decided to go and spread it out to all of their people, which is why the First Crusade resulted in about 40,000 people. An analysis of this source reveals that it is an extract, and again an initial trigger of the Crusades. It's important to consider because of the impact this speech had. People died because of this speech. Hundreds, thousands of people died because of this. And it was quite a shocking. Lots died on the journey, lots were attacked on the journey, and lots died when they reached the city. The speech was used in Clermont, France, to a mixture of Christian leaders and lords, who then asked their followers and servants such to help. It was because it was spoken in front of these people that it is so interesting. Many of these lords had sinned in their lives, and when Pope Urban stated that any who went to Jerusalem and helped on the pilgrimage would be sent to heaven, they were thrilled and they all decided to enlist. And the speech is also uses a lot of high impact words and such. Let me just have a look. Behold, on this side will be the sorrowful and poor, and on that the rich. On this side the enemies of the Lord, on that his friends. So even in that sentence, there is just so many high impact words, and just the feel of the text is very, confronting and aggressive. It is also important to assume and remember that because Pope Urban spoke this in front of so many people, the information he told would not have been actually accurate, and some of it would have been lies and just exaggeration, so people would fight for the Pope and his people. So yeah, I believe this source is a very useful source because it was the trigger of the Crusades. However, during that time, we can tell that a lot of it was, made up and not the best. Yeah. The last source we have is an excerpt of the Jewish chronicler, a book by the Jewish chronicler Solomon Bar Samson, and it was written in 1096, so the First Crusade again, when the Crusaders were on their journey to Jerusalem and the Holy Land. And it's quite a sad source, because you see, at the time, it was a recount of how the Jewish people saw the Crusaders, and the Jewish people experienced a lot of hate and aggression from the Crusaders, who believed that as Christians they were better than the Jews, and the Jews were also not as good as the Muslims, so they were kind of in this horrible, place where they were degraded and mistreated, yet at the same time they weren't allowed to be killed. But they still were, and a lot of them faced a lot of fear because of what the Christians might do to them. This source is a primary source. It was written by a group of people at the time who all went under the one name as a chronicler, and it's a very important source because we don't know a lot about what the Jews thought of the Crusades, and a lot of bad things happened to them during this time. The source was written in 1096, which was the year the First Crusade started, and it's important to consider this because they would have seen all of the Crusaders go past on this journey. The source was, as I said, made by the Jewish chronicler the Solomon Bar Samson, and they were a group of people who wrote under the anonymous name because they could not be known that they were writing this truthful things about the Christians. And the importance of this source is that it provides an insight into how the Crusaders were and what they did to the people. I mean, all the sources that have survived today, a lot of them were written by the Christians, and as a result, they're very, the Christians were great, we saved the Holy Lands, but not a lot is like used to focus on what they did to the people on their journey, and this source shows us a lot. It reveals what the Christians did to them, which included, I believe it said, suggesting casual sex, exterminating them from the nations so that the name of Israel will no longer be remembered, or letting them adopt their faith. Like, they didn't have a lot of choice and experienced a lot of fear. The conclusions that can be made by studying this, I feel, are that the source was it's very poignant, and it's very important to look at because it shows us what the Crusaders were like on their journey. And there's not a lot of reason why they would have lied in this. I mean, it was from a lot of different people, so they would have had a lot of different people looking at the same thing, so different accounts would have merged together. But, I believe this source would have been quite trustworthy at the time, and yeah. Okay, so that's all for my sources today. Thank you.